My first observation is perhaps a common one to many of us, that the career one pursues is often not the career one expected. Personal roads may appear to be straight and true, but that's an illusion. For me, a puzzling question is how does a small town boy from northern Maine become an historian of Mexican history? I was born in 1938. Sí, hace muchos años. My father was a jornalero, y later a mechanic. My mother cleaned other people's houses. My extended family was mainly working class. Clearly my roots play a major role in my kind of history that matters to me, and for that I make no apology. Now, in some ways, northern Maine might seem very far culturally from Mexico. You may not believe this, but I did not hug my father until my mother died. Although it is changing in my home state of Maine, personal emotions are often suppressed or understated. Yet as individuals, I believe that we are not just products of history and culture, or socioeconomic forces, nor are our lives governed by random accidental events. Rather, deep personal processes also influence our lives. Although not college educated, my father still paid attention to events in the wider world and encouraged my reading and my education. His politics were progressive but non-judgmental. My mother, however, was my reverse muse. My reverse muse. I argued against every conservative opinion that she ever had, and they forced me to think critically and coherently, certainly encouraging a contrarian streak in me. In that northern New England town, I was a rare New York Yankees baseball fan when everybody else cheered for the Boston Red Sox. So something like a tapatio cheering for America. Perhaps this is instructive. Se puede pedir con mi esposa, pero... Ay, perdón, after high school, I enrolled at Boston University. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, but I heard that accountants made $10,000 a year. And so I enrolled as a business major. I had to take an elective course, so I chose Latin American art. I haven't a clue why. The course turned out to be about the great Mexican muralists, Rivera, Siqueiros, Orozco, and I had never seen such things. They literally opened a new world for me. From there, I took a course in Latin American history, and my career began. Now, admittedly, at first glance, this introduction to Latin America and Mexico appears to be an accident. Yet, I do not believe in accidents. Not for great historical movements and not for individual lives. Bernard Malamud wrote in his magnificent book, The Fixer. No sé cómo en español, Fixer, pero en un libro increíble. Pues, in times of great crisis, history is thick, Malamud said. History is thick. What he meant was that when great historical forces intersect, individuals cannot avoid involvement in the history around them. I entered graduate school in the 1960s, a time of great upheaval. It was in this political environment, the civil rights movement and anti-Vietnam movement in the United States, an anti-imperialist, pro-democratic movement in Latin America, that I solidified my interest in Mexico and in Latin America. In graduate school, I studied economics and history and eventually earned a PhD in Latin American Studies at American University in Washington. In the 1960s, the US government was afraid, of course, of Cuban communism. So ironically, the US government provided graduate degree scholarships for an entire generation of left-wing historians like me. I will say that Fidel put me through graduate school. So in the fall of 1965, in a 1958 Ford Falcon with a wife and 2-year-old son, I drove south to Mexico. Now, I learned many things in those early years in Mexico. I learned that Mexicans welcomed a young foreign scholar to their country with generosity and pride. In the abandoned Metepec mill in the textile town of Jalisco, near Cholula, on hearing my purpose to write of the turbulent labor history of his father's generation, the security guard refused my propina with dignity. It said simply, "Be careful of the holes in the floor." And so I wandered through that enormous abandoned mill, accompanied only by the ghost, Hola Mexico, by the ghost of those brave and tenacious men and women who once worked those clattering new, now silent machines. Okay. In those days, I spent a good deal of time at the Colegio de Mexico. Then under the leadership of Daniel CUCEA Villegas, one of the great academic and public figures of his age. I remember him fondly for his warm welcome. When I stumbled with my poor Spanish, he gently suggested that I could speak English if I liked. I thanked him, but stubbornly refused. The finest hour of my poor Spanish came in the spring of 1966, when I interviewed a 95-year-old man. He was a former reporter of the important Porfiriato Veracruz daily newspaper, El Dictamen. After half an hour or so, he asked me, "Es Mexicano o Norteamericano?" Well, he was 95 years old, so why not? At the Colegio, two historians who were the most helpful and influential on my work were Luis Gonzalez y Gonzalez and Moises Gonzalez Navarro. In particular, Moises, who came from a prominent Tapatio family, was generous of his time and support through my stay in Mexico and throughout the years since then. In those contentious years in Mexico, in the 1960s and early 70s, the political sympathies of young foreign scholars, such as myself, were generally with the opposition, but we were leery of attracting the attention of the authorities. In those days, the Archivo General de la Nación was located in the Palacio Nacional. Researchers entered the public entrance and then walked through a private gateway past the stairs to the upper stories where the president's offices were located, and on to the Archivo. One day there was a demonstration, a political demonstration outside the Palacio, and I stopped to watch, and I took the political flyers that were being handed out. When I went to enter the private entranceway in the Palacio, for the first time, there was an armed soldier stopped me and motioned with his rifle to open my briefcase. You know, my heart, blood ran cold. But then I remembered that I had not put the subversive literature in my briefcase, but in my jacket pocket. Gracias a Dios. There are many stories of those days. I remember particularly meeting an old anarchist supporter of Ricardo Flores Magón. His name was Nicolas Bernal. We were both working in the Treasury archives at the time. So one day he asked me if I would take him in my car to the National History Museum at Chapultepec. An artist was painting murals there and wanted Nicholas as a subject. It was only as we were driving there that I asked him, who's the artist? And he replied, Siqueiros. I said, Siqueiros? Wow, okay. So I waited around with Nicholas until finally Siqueiros arrived, and the great man arrived with his European sports car. And I got to shake his hand, which I haven't washed since then. By the way, if you look at the panel of the Cananea strike in the National History Museum, I believe that Nicholas is the martyr being held high by his fellow workers. So, how did I move from Mexico City to Guadalajara? My decision to change my focus from national to regional history is a product of two very different factors. First, my academic interest had evolved from the labor movement to urban history. Mainly because I had become convinced that only in local history could one observe the socioeconomic mechanisms that characterize the lives of ordinary people, which was really my interest. As many of my generation, my thinking was heavily influenced by E.P. Thompson's cultural Marxism. Guadalajara seemed a natural subject. History and city and its hinterlands had played a crucial role in the 19th century resistance to Mexico City's dominance. The second factor that drove me west to Jalisco had nothing to do with history. By the mid-1970s, I had found that a few hours working in the Archivo General de la Nación gave this enormous headache. And of course, caused by the pollution in Mexico City. On the other hand, Guadalajara's location, its reasonable size, like casi 2 millones en este tiempo, and its reputation for small industry rather than mega factories promised more breathable air. Before I arrived in Guadalajara in the fall of 1977, I was doing research in the labor archives of the Archivo General when I met the historian Carmen Ramos. It turned out that she was a friend of Carmen Castañeda, then the director of the Jalisco State Archives. She volunteered to write me a letter of introduction, and that is how I got to know the person who would play such an important role in my work on Guadalajara. Carmen became a kind of, how shall I say, directive older sister that I never had. And Marco became the brother that I never had. Fortunately, he and I were more or less mature when we met. Or I know we would have gotten into a lot of trouble. Between them, I worked harder and enjoyed it more than ever I did in Mexico City. For one thing, they invited me to their apartment. First time I'd been invited to a Mexican home. After that, I was given no choice but to stay with them when I came to Guadalajara. I came to know all of Carmen's siblings and their children's birthdays. We have dedicated volume 2 of our series to Carmen. She's sorely missed. In Guadalajara, I came to know Mexico as I never did and perhaps never could in Mexico City. Initially, my goal was to write the great urban history. Well, there are historians here who have done much of that work that I wanted to do, including Sonia Perez, who's written a fine history of Mexico City. At the time, I thought of myself as an historian of 20th century Mexico, but I thought that I would do a little background research in colonial history. And so in 1977, I began my research at the Archivo Municipal de Guadalajara in the era of Director Don Salvador Gomez Garcia. In those days, the Archivo Municipal was located in El Centro before moving to the beautiful building near the Plaza del Sol where it is today. One day, perhaps a week or two after I arrived, and here let me quote in Spanish from my article in Estudios Sociales, Doña Herminia Ramírez, una empleada de largo tiempo, se me acercó con un enorme legado. Quizás le gustaría ver esto, dijo, y me dio el trabajo de mi vida. Eran los padrones de 1821 y 22. I had never seen such incredible resources. Páginas tras páginas de información maravillosas de individuos, familias y grupos domésticos. Ink as black as the day had been written, as if it had been written yesterday. At the time, I did not have a clue how to use that data, but I knew I had to learn. And this was the beginning, of course, of the Guadalajara Census Project, and my career took an unexpected turn from which I have never returned. Now, in those days, research was far more informal than today. Perhaps 3 or 4 weeks after beginning research at the Archivo Municipal, I was furiously taking notes because the traditional closing time of 3 p.m. was fast approaching. By then, I'd become known to the staff as a serious researcher. I looked up from my work as the last empleado left the room. Looking over his shoulder, he called, "Don't forget to turn out the lights and lock the door." I was terrified. Here I was, a young foreign scholar left alone in the Archivo archives with centuries-old priceless documents. I was too scared, too shaken to do any more work, and I left the building as soon as I could. And then there was the incident of the copier. Now here again, let me quote from my article in Estudios Sociales. El jefe Don Salvador generosamente me permitió fotocopiar los manuscritos del censo. En aquellos días, el archivo no contaba con un fotocopiador. Llévatelos a copiar y tráelos mañana. Mis manos literalmente